Good afternoon, and welcome to the Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar featuring Behnam Ben Taleblu. As many of you who follow Emmett's work and recent webinars are aware, we've been paying particular attention to issues surrounding the Islamic Republic of Iran and its quest to obtain nuclear weapons. In particular, we've been extremely concerned about the Vienna negotiations that appear to be concluding with an awful and dangerous deal to be signed. I'm therefore thrilled to host Behnam this afternoon so that he can share his knowledge and insights on this frightening situation. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to keep my introductory remarks brief. Please do check out our website at www.emmettonline.org and continue your support for our important work. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. He previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and native Farsi skills, Behnam has closely tracked a wide range of Iran-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. Frequently called upon to brief journalists, congressional staff, and other Washington audiences, Behnam has also testified before the U.S. Congress and Canadian Parliament. His analysis has been quoted in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Fox News, and the Associated Press, among others. He's contributed to or co-authored articles for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Fox News, The Hill, War on the Rocks, The National Interest, and U.S. News and World Report. Behnam has appeared on a variety of broadcast programs, including BBC News, Fox News, CBS Interactive, C-SPAN, and Defense News. If you have something you'd like to ask Behnam, you can post your question using the Q&A button on your screens below, and I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible a bit later in the program. Please be sure to post in the Q&A and not the chat function. Today's event will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days. Welcome, Behnam, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so
much. I want
to
start by asking you if you could give us some insight. It's great to have you again. Welcome back. Can you give us some insight into what exactly is motivating both the U.S. on the one hand and Iran on the other to pursue negotiations for this nuclear deal now? I mean, I understand Iran got hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief when Obama entered into the JCPOA, but Trump pulled out and slapped massive and crippling sanctions on Iran that were having, I think, a significant effect. And then Biden reversed course, essentially quietly lifting sanctions and simply not enforcing others. So Iran stands to gain a huge windfall again for a deal that we'll get into the specifics on shortly, but which basically will be short-lived with very few restrictions on its program itself. So it makes sense for Iran, but why is this Obama team of Biden, Blinken, and Malley willing to basically hand Iran a nuclear weapon, just delayed a couple of years, and doing so when we know they were cheating the entire time under the JCPOA, thanks to Mossad's recovery of Iran's nuclear archives. So can you make some sense out of what's going on in Vienna?
Sure. Well, let me just reiterate again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I know we have a lot of really good questions coming, and I want to make sufficient time and space for the audience Q&A. So I don't want to be, I think it was Mercutio or Tybalt in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet when he said, I will be brief, and then there's like a 20-page monologue. So I don't want to say I will be brief and then go on, but you ask a very, very important question to begin our conversation today. I think you hit the Iranian intentions on the head. Let me just reiterate what they are very quickly, because the team at the helm today in the Islamic Republic is content with the mask coming off. The cabinet of Iran's ultra-hardline president, Ebrahim Raisi, who really earned his stripes by signing off on death orders in the 1980s, basically clearing out by killing Iran's prisons at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq war. This is the way this person jump-started his career in his late 20s, early 30s, and then basically moved through Iran's injustice system. It's the judicial system. We call it the injustice system, basically failing upwards, being promoted. And then ultimately now he is someone who many people believe could be a potential replacement for the supreme leader. So he's really earned his revolutionary stripes, you could say. This person's cabinet is the most sanctioned cabinet in the history of the Islamic Republic, not just sanctioned under US authorities, but UN authorities, EU authorities, UK authorities, and actually even select Interpol red notices. There are literally wanted terrorists on that cabinet. And this is having the most sanctioned cabinet, as some of you may know, in the Islamic Republic's history is no small feat, given who else has served in other cabinets in the past and who has been president in the past in that country as well. So this is a signal that the mask is coming off and the intentions are actually much more readable. And as you mentioned, those intentions are to basically get as much cash up front and to retain as much of their nuclear program as possible. And that ties neatly into the second half of your question, which is the American side. Why would the US want to do this? Why would the newly reconstituted nuclear negotiating team of the Biden administration want to do this? What's the angle there? And I think for our audience, many of us have lived it. American domestic politics in the past decade, but particularly half decade, have been particularly hyper-partisan, have been particularly nasty, have seen the transformation of non-partisan or bipartisan issues into partisan or hyper-partisan issues. Unfortunately, with the advent of the JCPOA, Iran became one of them. You know, there were times, you know, Senate resolutions would pass 99-1 or 100-0. Those days are not here anymore. Those days are gone. Our adversaries understand that we lack consensus at home. And it's not just limited to Iran. This is North Korea, China, and Russia. And you're seeing the Russia one at the elite level and the grassroots level in full force today. So because the Iranians understand the back and forth of our Iran policy debate, because it's so public, and JCPOA exposure gave them access to a certain flank of American society, American media, American politics, American think tankers, they can read us a little easier. And they understand that if there's a change in administrations, there may be a change in it again. So them demanding super hard in Vienna for concessions on the economic file is them trying to insulate their economic armor, get as much cash up front as possible and as much market access as possible to absorb the blow that may be coming again if there is another pressure campaign. You know, it's no secret. Many on the Hill, many, prominent Republicans have been issuing letters, passing legislation, passing resolutions about what a new GOP foreign policy could look like. And the de minimis of that is leaving an Iran deal that the Biden administration may go into. So they understand that. So they want as much nuclear much of their nuclear program intact as possible so they can have their nuclear snapback option. And we've seen that snapback in real time from 2019 to present, but realistically from November 2020, when Biden was elected up until present, which is when you had the regime engage in irreversible nuclear advances. So they want to preserve that nuclear snapback. And here they want to preserve their they want to gain as much economic benefits or goodies as possible. And that dovetails into what the Biden administration may want, which is if this is what is so clear about what our adversary wants, why is Washington doing this? One is, of course, many of the Biden administration folks, as you mentioned, are veterans of the Obama era, and they genuinely believe it is a good deal. Now, they don't make the same kind of transformational arguments that in 2015, for instance, people talked about Iran evolving while under the JCPOA, or Iran using a nuclear deal to change, or supporting the moderates. You remember many of these arguments, fatally flawed arguments for a fatally flawed deal from 2015. Many of them haven't come to pass. So the proponents who were in the administration then and are in the administration now, their argument is a little bit more transactional, that they're talking about being realistic on foreign policy, that what they want to do is not necessarily resolve the Iranian nuclear program, but they're looking to just cap the threat. And ultimately, this quest for a cap has led to a backslide in US positions. If you remember from, basically when Biden was campaigning, talking about getting a better deal, to when he came into office in January up until April 2021, when indirect nuclear diplomacy began, U.S. officials had talked about getting a longer and stronger deal. But then they ended up just talking about just getting the JCPOA, just getting back the 2015 deal, making that the benchmark. And then once indirect diplomacy began with the Raisi administration in November 2021, there were rumors that the U.S. had tried to sell the idea of an interim deal or a lesser deal to its allies, such as Israel, for instance. There's even reports that in 2022, the Russians, with American cognizance, had offered the Iranians an interim deal idea. The Iranians had always shunned it, but basically what's being reported now in terms of potentially agreed upon sanctions relief is the US offering more in terms of economic benefits and the Iranians offering less in terms of select time-limited nuclear restrictions, which means this is a fundamentally new deal. Which means why would the Biden administration settle for this? Because they're not looking for a full resolution. They're looking for a way to buy select amount of time, perhaps a particular political angle there, perhaps 2 to 3 years, getting to them to the next election cycle, And they will frame this as being responsible, even though I think it's the height of irresponsibility to give the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism cash and sanctions relief and market access and, continued domestic enrichment, which we don't even allow some of our allies to do. But that being said, they will say this is responsible because they want to cap the most urgent threat from Iran, which they'll cite as nuclear, kind of dismissing terrorism, dismissing missile, dismissing human rights, dismissing illicit finance. And then they'll say they're doing this because they want to address other threats. China is a big issue. There's consensus in DC on China, for instance, perhaps changing the policy on North Korea, or perhaps channeling the time now vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia to get more consensus on that issue. But as our adversaries tell us, there is much more linkage there. And one of the fatal flaws of the Biden administration's overall foreign policy approach is that it segments or compartmentalizes these adversaries, when in reality, these adversaries, even though they may still have drama with each other and still have political issues with each other, the Venn diagram that draws them to coordinate on Russian and Iranian interests, on Chinese and Iranian interests, that point in the middle is getting bigger and bigger. And that point in the middle is contesting American power, overturning the US balance of power, US sponsored balance of power in their region, and working to end the American-led liberal world order. And my fear is a nuclear deal that provides the Islamic Republic with cash now and perhaps a pathway to nuclear weapons later would do exactly that in the region.
So we're going to get into a lot of those points that you raised in much more detail. I feel like the Biden administration is pulling the wool over the eyes of Americans. For instance, we just learned that in addition to Iran plotting assassination of former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Iran envoy Brian Hook under the Trump administration, now we learned that John Bolton, they've been plotting an assassination of him, and the administration is refusing to take any steps for indictments or to do anything on that so as not to draw attention to the craziness of all of this. And so that takes me to my next question, which is, are the mullahs rational? And does the West understand them and their goals of global expansionism? You and I, we've had the opportunity to speak about the problem of having policymakers in place who don't understand history, don't understand cultures and the mentality of our adversaries. And I fear that this is a clear case of that now, which is insane, given Putin's recent threat of using nuclear weapons. What happens when Iran gets them? Your FDD colleague, Emanuele Ottolenghi, wrote a great piece last week in Tablet in which he stated, and this is a quote, "Iran remains at heart a revolutionary power driven by an ideology that successfully blends Persian nationalism, Shiite revivalism, third worldism, and revolutionary Marxist-Leninist theories. The revolution's devastating potential always derived from the explosive combination of the subversive with the divine. The desire to push this agenda more aggressively and more successfully is what drives its quest for nuclear weapons." Behnam, are they rational? Can they be trusted, the way other civilized countries have been trusted to date before Putin started throwing out the threats? Or are we, starting like a major situation here?
Well, I think there's some important cleavages to cut across there in your comments, which I think are important. One is, between rationality and trust, and the other is something that I, kind of made a career off of, given that I'm Iranian American. But it's something I believe, but it's also something I have by virtue of lived experience. Let's never blend and let's never mistake, the identity of the people in Iran with the identity of the regime. I'm not saying you're doing that, but just in general, it's always good to have this in the back of our mind, especially if we are going to look fondly on history. Iran is a great civilization. It's heirs to many great civilization. It's an amazing country. It just happens to be ruled over by a clerical mafia that has a terrorist IRGC apparatus at the helm. And it's really a shame, because when you look at Iranians in the diaspora, Iranians abroad, they tend to be, there's a saying that is quoted often now, I don't know who coined it, but they're successful everywhere but in their own country. And that really is a shame. And that really is perhaps the clearest achievement of the revolution, really setting that country back, eroding its potential. Now, there's a lot of books behind me. One of them is a history of Iran in the 20th century by an Oxford-trained Persianist who would occasionally write for The Guardian, James Buchan, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He had this great one-liner on the revolution, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to do my best to quote versus paraphrase, which is, "What the Iranians most sought to preserve, they lost, and what they wished, they never gained." That's basically the 1979 revolution in a nutshell. They wanted political freedoms, but they wanted to keep their social and economic freedoms. And then ultimately, they lost all of that. And now you have at home a nationalist population led by a Islamist regime, and you have at home a post-revolutionary society still led by that expansionist revolutionary regime. And these are two things in tension, because Iran's aggression abroad, the Islamic Republic's aggression abroad, is directly correlated with the repression that they also engage in at home. Proponents of exporting the revolution also are proponents of crushing the people who would rise up in nationalist protest against an Islamist regime. And we've seen that in multiple iterations. Turning that question onto its head with rationality and trust, and my fear for a lot of American adversaries is that they're hyper-rational, that they actually do read us. They may not read us the best, but they do read us. They try to weigh cost and benefit. And if there is no stick, if there is no impediment, isn't the height of rationality to continue to push and get what you want? You mentioned those plots against former administration officials. The organization I work for has been sanctioned and threatened by the Islamic Republic. People in our office have been. Several, other, just recently, I think this January, if I'm not mistaken, several other defense entities, defense contractors, prominent American persons were also sanctioned by the Islamic Republic. It is worrisome because days after they were sanctioned, there's the new replacement head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Ismail Ghani, inviting Americans, not Iranians, not their proxy groups, inviting Americans to engage in acts of domestic terrorism against each other, because it would be cheaper if Americans killed Americans who are proponents of pressure on Iran, rather than have Iran send proxies and do what they do. So when you look at the threats against Brian Hook or Bolton or anyone else who served the administration, Pompeo, the former president himself, former President Trump, it is worrisome. And I think this is where you got to put the partisan stuff aside. Iran cannot be permitted to engage in these kinds of activities on U.S. soil, period. Iran cannot be permitted to actually threaten like this former administration officials, to use and abuse the financial system to get money, to use and abuse businesses and foreign companies to get dual use items for its military program and its nuclear program, to actually try to, per a recent case of an attempted kidnapping of a U.S. citizen of Iranian origin who was a journalist in Brooklyn, to actually try to use an American private eye firm to try to spy on this person. And then ultimately they had a kidnapping plot that wanted to take her to Venezuela and from there to Iran. There's all these things that the regime is doing. And the height of rationality is, well, they have never really paid a price for it. Right after the revolution in 1980, they killed an Iranian diplomat in Maryland. The guy dressed up as a USPS guy. It was a radicalized lone wolf operation. There's a direct line from that to the attempted killing of the Saudi ambassador in 2011, also here in Washington. And this stuff will continue unless they pay a price, which again gets to the height of rationality. It has nothing to do with trust. My fear is that these adversaries, there's a book, I think Michael Hayden, the former NSA director, wrote a while back called Playing to the Edge. America's adversaries play to the edge.
It's quite frightening, and I think also the Obama administration seemed to ignore the threats. For instance, the threat to the Saudi ambassador in Washington, and now we've got the same thing happening. It's like deja vu. One of the most mind-boggling aspects of the Vienna talks was recently brought to the attention of everyone. It's been in the news a lot over the past several days, when a video surfaced of Russia's lead negotiator in Vienna bragging about how Russia, Iran, and China teamed up together to deliver huge wins for Iran, sharing that Iran received, the quote was, much more than any of them had ever expected. So in the middle of Biden promising crushing sanctions on Russia, we've got Russia negotiating on behalf of the U.S., since Iran humiliatingly won't let the U.S. sit in the same room. Can you spend some time talking about the intertwined relationship among Iran, Russia, and China vis-a-vis the deal? In particular, Russia and Iran have expressed their desire for expanded relations in both the arms and energy industries, cyber warfare. Russia stands to gain a lot from this. And to make matters even worse and more embarrassing, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, demanded a written guarantee from Biden that its Ukraine-related sanctions won't interfere with Russia's commercial arrangements with Iran. We've got the Chinese foreign minister who's describing what a great relationship Russia and China have. It's a crucial bilateral relationship. How can Biden ever think that putting Russia and China in charge of negotiating with Iran is good for the U.S. national security, let alone peace in the world?
Yeah, it's very puzzling. People who focus on Middle East issues, particularly on the counter ISIS stuff, they may know this phrase by, with, and through, working with local partners to work with them by, with, and through to achieve your aims on the battlefield. Diplomatically, and as you mentioned, it's a strategic mistake is being polite. Working by, with, and through Putin's Russia, which does what you're seeing in Ukraine quite plainly, or Xi Jinping in China, but working by, with, and through these actors to resurrect what was by 2015 standards by the known Iranian nuclear infrastructure, to resurrect that fatally flawed deal is a gross strategic mistake. It's one of the biggest self-inflicted wounds I think that the U.S. would do if it actually gets around to resurrecting an even lesser version of that agreement. Now, to be totally fair, the reason we have this mechanism, and to be fair to history, I think in 2006 this mechanism was created, the P5+1 mechanism. Part of it is the way the Bush administration dealt with Iran after the midterms in 2006. The other part of it is the Bush administration kind of atoning internationally for the Iraq war unilateralism, so it pivots to hyper multilateralism. But the thinking there was whatever agreement is achieved, because then the Europeans were still leading negotiations and the Americans and Iranians hadn't been directly negotiating, then they wanted to take whatever it was and enshrine it at the UN level. And the thinking or the thought process was, if you have everybody from the P5+1 negotiating, well, then whatever deal you get, you can immediately bless it at the UN Security Council. But my issue there is I understand the logic of that, and it makes sense if you want to immediately bless it. But my priority is, getting a good deal, number one. Number two, not working with other malign foreign actors to get that good deal. And number three, I'm more worried about being consistent with US law rather than multilateral organizations or international obligations under entities like the UN, which have their own fair share of warts and problems that there is not even enough time on this webinar to get into, but I'm sure you and Emmett and many of our esteemed audience know quite well. So my priority would be that, but I can understand how this mechanism came about, but that's where it came about. But thinking that stuff should be the priority is how you get to where we are today. Right now, the US is essentially, if I'm not mistaken, pleading with Venezuela, trying to reverse course to try to get oil from Venezuela, thinking that Venezuelan oil companies would snap to it just because the Biden administration wants them to backfill some of the energy sanctions here, some of the energy markets here due to increasing energy sanctions on Russia. Not only do markets not necessarily work like that, people who are in charge of rogue regimes don't necessarily think like that. And that's why culture and history and perspective actually really does matter. To think that the Venezuelans would do an about face just because the US asked something is to really believe the talking points that you were saying about one administration being qualitatively different, or all they need to be is not Trump, or all they need to be is not a Democrat, or all they need to be is not a Republican for America's adversaries to stop being America's adversaries. There's something endogenous per what Emmanuel was writing there in these adversaries for them to harbor long-standing trends of aggression, and to, when we need help, to not want to help us, but to actually want to spite us. So I have some concerns about the current play, thinking again that Venezuela would rush to help America, when in reality, Russia and Iran actually had been helping bail out Venezuela when it was under maximum pressure sanctions from the former administration. So this is misreading the geopolitical chessboard on steroids, as is thinking that providing some sort of guarantee, whether it would be to the Iranians or whether it would be to the Russians, would be good. Now, I have faith in a lot of the good people at the Treasury Department. In general, the U.S. doesn't go around providing all of these sorts of guarantees. It puts out these things after sanctions are added to or removed, called frequently asked questions, where it helps companies come into compliance with U.S. sanctions, whether they're unilateral or extraterritorial. There's all these things that the U.S. does for good business practices, for transparency purposes, telling you where you need to exercise enhanced due diligence, telling you about the issues doing a business in XYZ country. And I don't think that the U.S. would go about undercutting all of that good infrastructure for how to engage in good international business to basically give the Russians a pass, because all of a sudden the Russians want to use Iran as a way to get around increasing Ukraine sanctions. That's essentially what's happening here, and we need to call a spade a spade. The Iranians understand that they're the junior partner in the relationship to the Russians and the Chinese, and sometimes a junior partner gets goodies, like they got the S-300, the surface-to-air missile defense system that the Russians have. It's the most advanced foreign procured air defense system that the Iranians have, that was basically from the Russians to the Iranians. But other times you're used as the shield. And the Russians now are friendly with this country to the south. They're friendly with Iran, who has decades of experience busting sanctions. Russia has had now similar sanctions on them. I'm sure there's going to be increased political coordination. And I'm sure that, again, this is Lavrov, this is Putin, this is Ulyanov looking to draw America's adversaries together, share learned experiences, and then exploit America's weaknesses, whether it's market-based, whether it's political, whether it's military, whether it's risk-taking in other vectors, cyberspace, whatever, and using this learned experience to fight the US in a different theater at a time of their own choosing. And I think that's what we really have to be aware of here, which is why I think the mistake for the administration is treating these countries entirely in isolation. I'm not for over-connecting. Russia and Iran still have drama with one another, but they are increasingly moving together, and that circle of convergence risks making them the same circle. But we cannot deny that there is that circle. And to deny there is that circle would be to exercise what my friend and colleague, Bill Roggio, who runs FED's Long War Journal, says, which is that there's many in Washington who love to disconnect the dots. Let's not overconnect the dots, but let's not disconnect the dots. Let's let those dots speak for themselves. And nothing speaks for itself like that Ulyanov video, where he's literally saying the Russians and the Chinese were Iran's lawyers on the P5+1. And this exposes the folly of the by, with, and through America's adversaries to prevent the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism from getting nuclear weapons. It's totally backwards.
It is. And as you were talking about Venezuela, actually, I was also thinking of the fact that the Biden administration has been trying desperately to reach out to the Saudis and the Emiratis, and they are both are refusing to speak with Biden because of the way he's alienated them. And I think the naivety on the part of this administration is really shocking. So I think this is a good time. Ben.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead. You hope it offers.
Just a footnote to that. I hope it offers an opportunity for the Biden administration to reassess its GCC policy, particularly vis-a-vis the Saudis, but the Emiratis too. I mean, there's different areas there, but on Saudis and oil, I really think that there needs to be a reassessment, and a fast one, as to the accommodate Iran, turn a blind eye to the Houthis, think you can simply delist and the problems will go away. The problems are enduring because the adversaries want them to be festering hotspots across the region. They're not there because they don't like one party or another party, or they'll hop to it when we say, you should jump, and they'll say how high. These are contests. These are political contests. And what that means is we need to actually work with our allies. We need to actually have our allies back, whether it's Saudi, whether it's Israel, whether it's whatever. For partners in Northeast Asia, such as China, such as Japan and South Korea, to counter a rising North Korea and a rising China.
So I think this might be a good time for you to share with the viewers what concessions we believe Biden will be handing to the Iranians in terms of sanctions waivers, including terrorism, human rights, and missile sanctions, which are unrelated to the nuclear sanctions. There's rumors of a signing bonus in the form of $7 billion, asking the IAEA to shut down its ongoing investigation of nuclear material found in Iran. And the most recent of which are these inherent guarantees that the successor administration, US administration, won't pull out of the deal, which yet another one of your FDD colleagues, John Schanzer, tweeted over the weekend, quote, tells you all you need to know. The Biden White House has capitulated to the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism. Can you share with us just how bad this is and why people are calling it the new worst deal in history? And of course, please touch on the sunsets that have already kicked in and what is going to kick in the near future as well.
So there's a lot there to unpack. And even in 2015, per the JCPOA, per that agreement, there was relief given to these bad actors, or there was a schedule for relief given to these bad actors. For instance, in 2015, once that agreement was inked, and then days later it was codified, again, because they love the Security Council, it was codified in a new UN Security Council resolution called 2231. It had an annex there that contained other lapsing prohibitions. So not even just sunsets on the nuclear file, but there were political prohibitions that would lapse. One was an arms embargo that was existent in an older UN Security Council resolution that was permanent, arms to and from Iran. Iranians violated it while the embargo was on there. And that ended up lapsing in 2020. And then the other one is an area that I focus almost kind of obsessively on is on ballistic missiles and missiles and long-range strike capabilities in general. The administration subjected that, which was a permanent prohibition on ballistic missile testing and related activity, and then they caveated it first by limiting it to an 8-year ban. So this ban will actually expire in 2023. So if we get into this deal in 2022 and we don't amend this UN Security Council resolution political timeline, and all indications are that we are not going to extend that timeline by putting more distance between us and the end of the prohibition, then ultimately that means next year Iran could legally do this, which means that even though they've been illegally doing this, at least you can have a case for multilateral pressure. It makes your case for multilateralism, something this administration said it wants to engage in very much. It makes its own case harder. And then you have to revert back to yourself, say, well, would I be willing to risk, coordination costs? Would I be willing to engage in sanctions against actors, in Europe, for instance, that may legally, per the UN, be supporting a sanctioned actor from Iran that is active on their territory, procuring stuff for their nuclear program or their missile program? The IRGC missile entities are going to be getting sanctions relief in the EU by 2023 per this deal. Resurrecting this at the time that Iran's missile capabilities are increasing rapidly. Just a few days ago, you had the head of that IRGC missile force entity. It's the IRGC Aerospace Force. He was just bragging on the Persian television and talking to Iranian news outlets, saying that Iran's missile power has increased 6 to 7-fold. Releasing sanctions on areas such as this would basically be underwriting the program. These programs have been able to advance while under pressure. So giving them sanctions relief would basically be putting the procurement, production, and proliferation elements of Iran's military network, and particularly its missile, ballistic missile, cruise missile, and even drone systems on steroids. And having that at a time when the US is less interested in staying in the region and having less of a capable coordinating mechanism with its allies really just paints a picture of to the very bad place we are going to be headed in between 2022 and 2024, when the Iranians have an incentive now to want to work to kick us out if they see this drawdown in forces or they see this lack of resolve against punishing bad behavior, whether it's terrorism or threats against Americans or illicit missile activity or missile testing, for instance. So there's all of this is a major problem. But to get to what we know, and I know there's been a lot of allegations about this non-nuclear relief, but these allegations are not new. And this is part of my problem with Washington, is that sometimes you'll see that the Iranian negotiators will be telling their parliament and their public more about what they've gained than American negotiators telling their Congress or their public about what they may have offered or what may have been on the table. Now, I understand the logic of not negotiating fully in public, but again, we are the ones with the culture of democracy, with the culture of transparency, not the Islamic Republic of Iran. Yet there really is something very lopsided here. And I'll prove it to you on 2 cases. So a friend of ours, Gabriel Nerona, had actually tweeted, and I think everyone by now has seen this extensive tweet thread about non-nuclear sanctions relief, particularly related to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps foreign terrorist organization delisting and the removal of an executive order by Trump. It was a bureaucratic executive order, exceptionally far-reaching executive order against the network of appointees and the Supreme Leader's office. So basically, if Khamenei appoints you to an official position, you can be sanctioned. So it's a very far-reaching economic penalty that the US had created in 2019. Iran's president, actually, President Raisi, is sanctioned under this authority. And so Gabriel had talked about the FTO designation being lifted and this executive order being removed. The problem is the former chief of staff for President Rouhani, Rouhani had 6 rounds of indirect nuclear diplomacy. As you mentioned, they made the US sit at a different table, in fact, in an entirely different room. 6 rounds between April and June. And after June is when the chief of staff of Rouhani's office, the office of the president, gave an extensive media interview saying exactly these things. A year ago, this was said. The Biden administration could have responded to this a year ago. But it also proves that a year ago, the Biden administration was that desperate, even pre-Raisi government, if this is true, of course, to give sanctions relief to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and to remove the penalties against the Supreme Leader's office. These 2 vectors, these 2 non-nuclear vectors, were just days later after that chief of staff interview, mentioned in an extensive report, a 70-plus page Persian language report from the Iranian Foreign Ministry to the Iranian parliament, where there was about 4 pages of here are all the sanctions relief that the Americans have offered. And it wasn't just the sanctions relief that you find in Annex 2 of the JCPOA, as well as the attachments. Annex 2 has attachments related to delisting entities, planes, ships, companies, banks, businesses, and even people. It wasn't just that. It included many of these, as you mentioned, new non-nuclear Trump-era penalties. And this gets us into the folly of going back into the deal now, is because last year, the Biden administration, I think in particular, Ned Price had talked about not being specific about the sanctions relief that was on offer, but just saying generally that sanctions that were inconsistent with the JCPOA would be removed. Well, it's clear now, based on what the Iranians were saying then, as well as what some sources in DC are saying now, is that what the administration believes is inconsistent is also non-nuclear sanctions. So this is a much larger boon to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Make no mistake, this is a political boon. This is an economic boon. This basically puts their nuclear program on steroids. It has the potential to put their military program on steroids. And it buys less time. Again, amid all this conversation about U.S. sanctions relief, there has been no leak, not on the Iranian side, not on the U.S. side, not on any side, about the additional concessions that America has been able to extract from the Islamic Republic. Nothing. I don't know of one.
I put 2 links in the chat for everybody. The first is to your article, Behnam, that I believe went up yesterday, in which you said the U.S. and Europe ignore Iranian missile tech developments at their own peril. So that link is there for everybody. And then you made reference to Gabriel Noronha's tweet, and he turned that into actually a long article in Tablet Magazine. So I put the link to that in the chat also for everybody. And there's a lot of questions in the queue. I still have a lot more of mine, but I want to focus on, does this deal give Iran a greater ability to threaten us in the future? And do you think it will lead to a greater risk of war? One thing we can be certain of is that once Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons is green-lighted, other countries in the region will start their own programs. And in fact, the Saudis have been working with China on building a facility for extracting uranium yellowcake from uranium ore, for a number of years now. And the Crown Prince said that if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. That's a quote. So we've got sanctions fully lifted, and that means that we're probably going to see a rise in terrorist activity when Iran's proxies in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen once again become flush with cash. And Lord knows if Iran actually obtains a nuclear weapon, what I fear would actually happen. So what are your thoughts on, Biden, they're kicking the can down the road, but is this actually increasing the threat of war, which is what the Israelis are arguing?
Yeah, and it's a very perverse situation to be in, because I fully expect if there is this new lesser deal agreed to, that the administration will defend it by saying this stems the most urgent threat, and therefore this prevents war. And therefore, if you're against this, then you're somehow weirdly very pro-war. Kind of like a hybrid or a compartmentalization of the argument in 2015, which is it's this deal or war, take it or leave it. We did the best we could. This is it. If there's not, you got to go to war. Fine. That was the line of argumentation then, and I fully expect that to be the line of argumentation now. But as you just really kind of eloquently laid out, with the rising proxy threat, with the rising missile threat, and the diminished timelines, and the lived experience we all went through from 2015 to present, which is, what did Iran do with that cash? It's not an academic question anymore. The growing defense budgets, literally the Iranian military commanders talking about the increases in their missile capability. You see it. You see the increasing accuracy. There is a statement that is a paraphrase, but the paraphrase was printed. The exact quote was not printed, but the paraphrase was from General McKenzie, who leads CENTCOM, which is the U.S. military force in the Middle East region. And ultimately, he's telling a reporter, I believe it was Robin Wright, in December 2021, and this was part of a much longer New Yorker story that talked about the evolution in Iran's missile and military capabilities, that the missile pace has almost outpaced the nuclear threat. These are things that the regime has been able to do with the dividends of early sanctions relief. These are structural things they got to take advantages of. And some of these are things that max pressure stopped. There are stories of the replacement to Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by that drone strike in January 2020. And his replacement is nowhere as charismatic. And his replacement took up the position when some of the Shia militias in Iraq were in disarray, but they were still firing rockets at bases that we were co-located at in Iraq. And ultimately, he's doing meetings there. And these are AP stories. You can go and look them up, where he doesn't have the cash that Soleimani had to go give these proxies. He's having to give them silver rings. And, Hezbollah at the same time is talking about the good days are gone, where the Iranians would be able to give them kind of cash directly. So we've lived through the experience of what happens when you give the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism cash and sanctions relief. And we've lived through the experience of, well, what happens when you restrict them? And I really do think making this Faustian bargain again is not only repeating the worst lessons of this lived experience for all of us, it's telling us something else. It's telling us that we're content to relive those worst lessons, which makes me, again, worry about the future of American foreign policy, worry about the longevity of those alliances that we've had with some of those countries you mentioned. I'm glad you brought Saudi Arabia to the fore, because ultimately, if I'm not mistaken, in January 2022, in January this year, many Middle Eastern countries continued to show that they were hedging. Not just our, kind of frenemy like Turkey. Turkey went to China for a day. Iran had actually gone to China for a day to really ink that 25-year strategic agreement. But select GCC countries went to China for a week to potentially explore the idea of GCC China free trade agreements. And so, again, when we're looking at things with this very narrow lens, we have to course correct here, because our great power competitors are actually interested in moving in and filling some of those vacuums that we're clearly very interested in getting away from and divesting from. And I really, nuclear is one, but missile is another. If you look at the balance in the region, you can kind of be coy and say the good guys in the Middle East have planes, and a lot of the bad guys have missiles. The Saudis now, it's not just the nuclear program that the Chinese may be allegedly supporting, it's the missile program. There has been talk since 2019, and again, it went public again in 2021, about Chinese support to a domestic solid propellant production facility inside Saudi Arabia. Solid propellant missiles are prized for their military maneuverability and reliability. You can basically fuel them, keep them there, and have them ready to go at a moment's notice. These are all signals that our partners in the region, anchors of our foreign policy, the front lines of defending our own interests too. This is not, charity. As Henry Kissinger said, foreign policy is not missionary work. We have convergent interests with these countries that we're doing these kind of things. They're basically acting like they don't think we're going to be in it for the long haul. Same with the UAE, for instance, not directly vis-a-vis China, but the kind of hedging they have to do because they're on the front lines. Do you remember? It was just weeks ago when the Houthis were firing cruise missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles at both civilian and non-civilian centers, U.S. and non-U.S. Targets inside the UAE. Hardline Iranian newspapers basically had pictures of like those large glass hotels and towers in downtown Abu Dhabi, basically saying, hint, hint, you're next. And this is the big fear of the JCPOA and the signing bonus coming to the Iranians, which is that it can put their method of diplomacy on steroids, which is to say, hey, accommodate us. And then when they don't get accommodated, you get hit. And then say, hey, accommodate us. And when they're not accommodated again, you get hit. And in this iterative dynamic, Iran is not looking to make the Saudis or the Emiratis pro-Iranian overnight. They're just interested in getting them to accommodate rising Iranian power more and be less interested in staying and upholding that US-led order, which basically paves the pathway for the export of the revolution, continued hegemony, and more money and more forces and more assets for Iran to continue to surge across the land bridge, unimpeded, unimposed, and basically put that knife that it already has against Israel's neck even closer.
Thank you, Behnam. I'm going to turn to the questions because we have so many of them, but a number of people are asking, can we put this to Congress, and how do we address this if the Biden administration is hell-bent on moving forward? And that takes me to the inherent guarantees, which we've touched on, but can you spend a couple minutes talking about how they're accomplishing this guarantee that a future administration will not pull out the way Trump did, given that Biden has refused to abide by US law and take the deal to Congress? I mean, you pointed out that the Iranian foreign minister, the Iranians know exactly what's in the deal. They're bragging about it to their people. And it's the complete opposite of what we're getting here in the US, where it seems to be very secretive. So what we know has been leaked out of the State Department, and there have been a number of people that have left the State Department, or at least left this part of their job. They've pulled out of helping in Vienna. What can Congress do? What can we as Americans do? A lot of people would like to know.
So just a couple of points there on the guarantee. It's my opinion, and this is just my opinion, that the Iranians are not actually looking for that guarantee. Because if you ever get to the position in life where the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran is telling, the country that it calls the Great Satan, morning, noon, and night, that I trust you if you write this down on a piece of paper and pass it through your government that I routinely attack and berate, and I will trust the end result of that. I will then tell you to see me after this conversation for an excellent 94 Toyota Corolla for a very special price. Because the government of the Islamic Republic has made a career out of not believing things that the US says, and it routinely is the bad faith actor in this relationship. So when the Iranians are talking about guarantees, that's their cue for us to fight us. That's their cue for one side to say, look, we need to offer them something more, and then the other side said, no, backpedal, and then there's the lack of consensus created against dealing with an authoritarian adversary. This is the goal. The goal is that ultimately, due to this, there's some kind of legal impediment on a future administration. We're not even sure how legal it could be, but there's some kind of bureaucratic impediment to make putting pressure on Iran in the future harder. So that is using Americans to handicap other Americans to make a future coercive American policy fight with one arm tied behind its back. That's goal one. And goal two is, amidst this chaos of should we give them this, should we give them that, what will they settle for, are we going to be Iran's lawyers here, is, well, in the interim, perhaps they may be placated with more money. Maybe they may not take the legal guarantee, maybe they'll take, or the political guarantee, maybe they'll take more money. And to use this vector, this line of attack, as a way to extract more goodies, more upfront financially from the deal negotiating process. And that's what I think ultimately they're going to do, because the point of the Iranians agreeing to this is not to become a responsible nuclear stakeholder. The point is to, again, as we said in the beginning, insulate their armor economically and preserve as much of their nuclear program materially. And they're preparing for when we will next come back in and sanction them and pressure them. They're preparing their snapback options. They're getting this money. They're going to be giving it to the proxies to be entrenching their position in the region, making it harder to contest them. And they're preserving this to, again, engage in this nuclear snapback, to get ready for the next race between sanctions and centrifuges. So even entertaining these debates about how can we preserve this, let's find a way to give them a guarantee, maybe the Iranians will accept an insurance policy, is real folly. The government of the Islamic Republic is not in the business of trusting things the US says, whether it's written on paper or sit at the negotiating table. And don't take it from me. Take it from then, Foreign Minister Zarif, even before Trump's maximum pressure kicked in, when people were still, starry-eyed about the JCPOA. I think he said this in New York, either at CFR or at Asia Society, and the video exists. I think he was interviewed by Charlie Rose. He said explicitly, I'm paraphrasing him, but the video exists. He says that this deal was not about trust. So let's not pretend that, again, getting back into it will be about trust. They are not in the business of trust.
Thank you.
And what can we do is a much larger question. For instance, now is the time to call Biden's bluff. If you remember, Biden wrote a pretty interesting op-ed in September 2020 when he was just a candidate for president, talking about willing to work more with regional partners, talking about not being impeded from issuing non-nuclear sanctions like human rights sanctions, which the administration has been really derelict in, and as well as ballistic missile sanctions. Where have those been? The head of the missile entity in Iran is saying that our missile power grew 6 to 7%. December 2021, there was a ballistic missile drill featuring 16 simultaneous short and medium range ballistic missile launches. I think it's been 4 satellite launch vehicles from December to present that the Islamic Republic has engaged in. Yes, some of them have been failures, but at least one of them have been with solid propellant, which tells you that they're looking to actually move from this space launch vehicle category, use that scientific technical cover towards longer range strike capabilities like an IRBM or even ICBM. So the threat that they will pose is going to be expanded. It's not just a threat to our assets and friends in the region. It's going to be to Europe, and then it's going to be to us. Literally, hardline newspapers are hailing these technical developments. You very kindly plugged my piece there. You know, they created this new solid propellant motor in January 2022, if I'm not mistaken. It's just a month and a half ago. This will give them enhanced capability, more thrust, more power. They haven't really tested it yet on an actual system, not to the best of my knowledge, but they have, you know, done a static test on the ground. These are signs of what is coming, and turning your eye away from them and giving the regime cash and hoping you can kick the can down the road is not going to make these problems go away. So more congressional oversight, more hearings, bringing in the administration to testify is basically a bare minimum at this point. That really hasn't even happened. It needs to happen publicly. It needs to happen much more often. Coordinating with countries that have similar kinds of sanctions regimes. I believe Canada, the UK, the EU, and Australia all have, for instance, Magnitsky sanctions. Rather than remove sanctions on Khamenei's office, we should be coordinating with our country, with our partners, who, especially if you like multilateralism, and they have been copy pasting the kind of non-nuclear human rights, corruption, and governance related sanctions that we have here, the good model that we established, and get them to establish a coordinated list, a menu of these human rights sanctions and anti-corruption sanctions that you can actually engage in. You know, put your money where your mouth is on these things.
Well, I would also argue that our media have been remiss in bringing attention to what's happening in Vienna. And I think the Ukraine war may be a gift to the Biden administration, done without too much attention, but I'm not convinced that it would have been reported properly, even if the war had not been ongoing. I think that the media, you know, we have Ben Rhodes talking about an echo chamber back in 2015 and selling the deal through media, basically propaganda. If this were being reported at all, it would, I think, once again, we would not be hearing the truth about it. Claire Lopez asked, how far along do you think the Iranian regime truly is with its nuclear weapons program? Do you think they already have nuclear warheads, perhaps not yet married to their missiles?
You know, I can tell you honestly that I don't know. And the thing is, there was just a recent U.S. intelligence assessment out that was a little too comfortable for many of us here in the Iran watcher community. It was defining a very, very, very narrow definition of weaponization. What we can tell you is that the deal, the JCPOA, which defenders, you know, in the immediate aftermath of 2015 used to come out and saying was the most stringent verification and inspection regime in history, did not catch the nuclear archive, which actually had evidence of Iran wanting to make up to 5 nuclear weapons. That is what the regime wanted to do. There was evidence of the digging, tunneling, things that they were doing for future enrichment facilities in that captured and exposed nuclear archive that Israel took and exposed and brought to the international community's attention. The IAEA inspection regime that everyone had touted did not catch that. That was a nation state that caught that. And ultimately, I don't think that they have gone there fully yet, but I can't tell you for sure. For instance, there's always a smaller bomb. There are designs that we now know, thanks to that atomic archive, as well as thanks to things that the IAEA has been saying since 2011 about the known bomb designs Iran would have for one of its missiles, which has a very large conical warhead. And this known bomb design may not fit in other smaller missiles that have a smaller nose cone or a biconic or a triconic warhead. Basically, these are just different shapes of warheads. But this does not necessarily mean to me that there's only one kind of bomb. You know, this is the military world. There's always a smaller bomb. But the thing is, we don't know what we don't know, to borrow a phrase, about their program. And this is why, before getting into some kind of a deal, establishing a clear baseline of what you had, when you had it, what were the military dimensions. People think that the IEA has resolved the possible military dimensions issues. There's still outstanding questions from 2015. That should be a major red light. You know, you mentioned the media, and I do give them a break a little bit because the Ukraine war has kind of kept everybody on edge. The JCPOA, for instance, we've been expecting it for days now. Everyone is still kind of manic. Everyone is kind of on edge. When is this thing happening? Is this an Iranian interruption? Is this a Russian interruption? What is happening here? There is a lot going on. But again, like they are not, and this is a polite criticism, I guess. They are not really putting the spotlight on all of the issues, such as there are safeguard violations that the IAEA has assessed today of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it's not really getting much press. It's getting some press, but it's not really getting much press. So if this kind of issue is not generating the political attention about a safeguards violation, this tells you, the adversary, this tells the Islamic Republic that there are going to be ways to cheat in the future because the US is going to be distracted because the US doesn't really want to solve this program. It just wants to cap it briefly and kick the can down the road. All these things, a bad deal, money up front, not enough political attention, coverage reporting going elsewhere. I'm not faulting. I'm just saying that this kind of mosaic is what you want if you're the Islamic Republic, because it slants the balance in your favor. And this is not to say that the Iran issue is somehow greater than the horrendous and grotesque invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, if we're going to be the country that we are, we're going to walk and chew gum at the same time. And that applies to think tanks, academics, policymakers, government, media. I think we can all do a little bit better. Emmett does a great job. I hope I'm following in that example too.
Thank you. And of course, the work of FDD is critically important. Emmett has been working on these issues. Our tablet article that I posted, we actually sent out the Twitter thread, and we've been fighting this thing for a long time. And of course, Behnam, all the folks at FDD that you work with, we've had on talking about various aspects of this. So we really appreciate all the work that you guys do, and we love working with you. There's been a number of questions about Israel. And where Israel comes into the mix on all of this. So I'm going to refer to Natan Sharansky's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on Monday, in which he explained why the U.S. moral abdication under both the Obama and Biden administrations led to Israel having, quote, no choice but to reach a strategic agreement with Russia to fight against Iran and its proxies. He stated that as a result of the imminent nuclear deal, quote, Israel will become even more dependent on Russia. Do you agree, Behnam, that that's the case? And can you add anything? I mean, somebody else asked a question about whether the Russia-China alliance is actually detrimental to Israel, and what can Israel do in the midst of all of this that's going on?
It's a tough question because I'm not an Israel analyst nor a Russia analyst, but just geopolitically taking a step back, yeah, I do have concerns here. I mean, on the one hand, you might be able to have Israel perhaps broker a ceasefire, but that may be a pipe dream. I don't know on the Ukraine front, but on the Syria front, again, I do wonder how much more reliant would the Israelis have to be on the Russians? Would the Russians perhaps use a changing Israeli stance on Ukraine against them in Syria? There are all these different vectors here, but the clearest one to me in the region and as it relates to Iran, which is my area of expertise, is that the Iranians are more afraid at the moment, in my assessment, politically, of an Israeli sort of strike than an American sort of strike. I think they have kind of post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, kind of not necessarily written off the potential, but it's diminished significantly. But I think when they saw the summer of escalation in 2020, all of the different nuclear site explosions, the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, really the chief, the crown jewel of Iran's military nuclear program. He sits at the nexus of that. Many people believe it was the Israelis. You had even a former Iranian intelligence official talk about Iranian officials not being safe due to Mossad penetration of the country. There's all these things there that, in my mind, would make a conflict more likely, and that would actually make the position of Israel or any other state in the region quite hard to work on countering those non-nuclear threats. And it would mean that the Islamic Republic would have more resources to devote to the counterpunch. Just recently you had Iran saying because of the murder, or when was it? I think it was 3 or 4 days ago. There was a strike that may have killed, I haven't seen it confirmed, but may have killed 2 Revolutionary Guard, not officers, but soldiers in Syria. There's some kind of retribution promised by Iran. Sometimes they may be able to act on it, but a lot of times they haven't. But if they have more money and more resources, the Israelis are going to have to be countering this on multiple fronts. And at a time when the U.S. is less interested in staying in the region, I think the Israelis are going to have to look elsewhere in the region. There's this historic trip to Turkey today. I wonder how that's going to play out. There's, of course, the potential for Saudi normalization as well. These are things that if you live in the region, you are going to have to be thinking about a little bit more critically, because if the U.S. is looking to get this deal, which makes pushing back on Iran entirely harder, you're going to need to look for more partners for that pushback. And again, that's potentially where bringing Israel into CENTCOM, great idea. Now let's build on that. That should be the price floor, not the price ceiling of what to do in a post-JCPOA scenario.
So it is one. I'm just going to end with one final question. And I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of the questions in the queue, but can you share with us what would be the realistic alternative to what we're facing now? This weak, horrible, disastrous deal.
Yeah, make no mistake, this was a choice. I think there's a book by Richard Haas, who's the head of CFR, War of Choice, War of Necessity. This is a policy pathway of choice. The Biden administration chose, when it was campaigning in 2020, to denigrate economic pressure. It chose to act on that denigration throughout 2021. It received historic leverage vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it could have really broken this trend of hyper-partisanship and seesawing 180 this way, 180 that way, 180 this way. And we're in store for another 180 if there's a political change, by the way, on Iran policy. That's the way I read the tea leaves. It could have broken that by building on that policy, capitalizing on that policy, realizing that those sanctions are predicated on long-standing trends in bad behavior. These are not artificial things that the administration is pointing to. These are predicates in the way the regime in the Islamic Republic of Iran behaves. These are things that we have agreed in the past to counter. And I think the administration chose the path of turning a blind eye, some unenforced sanctions, keeping some penalties on the books, again, removing some people from the sanctions list due to sanctions hygiene and other things that came about, such as lawfare. There was a law firm here removing a couple of entities that were allegedly tied in the past to the missile program. There's lots of little slippages in 2021. For instance, not using a single moment every time the Board of Governors met, which was 4 times a year at the IAEA in Vienna, not using any one of those moments to put diplomatic pressure on the Islamic Republic to call for even a resolution of censure. That's how committed the administration was to gaining and clawing back this fatally flawed deal, walking itself back from longer and stronger to JCPOA to JCPOA minus. These were all choices. I think they're wrong choices, but let's we can be a polite critic when we need to be, and I think this is somewhere we need to focus on criticism. This was a choice. We didn't have to come here. And they have their strategy set up. They're going to say that they got a lesser deal, that they blame Trump for taking time off the deal, and that ultimately it's this deal or war. You can write that down and measure it up with what they're going to say. But the alternative was to bear some more of the risks, to build on the pressure, to show America's authoritarian adversaries that they will not be able to cut us in half, internationalist, isolationist, partisan, bipartisan, nonpartisan, left, right, to say no, that these pressure vectors are there because they're there because of longstanding trends in your bad behavior. You want the pressure off, don't appeal to one half, don't appeal to the other half, change your behavior. And I think a fundamentally different policy would include more military and political support for our partners in the region, enhancing the US posture in the region, toughening up those sanctions, and then actually making an offer to the Islamic Republic. Here's what we're looking for in an end state. Can you meet that? And then as they mull that over, you really work to build a tough containment regime. And again, you do things like making the Israelis into CENTCOM be the price floor of what your regional policy looks like, not the price ceiling. Then you go about actually making sure the American people are on board for such a policy, telling them why this is in their national interest, and not letting it linger so that we can have more isolationist voices come in and say this is an Israel first, or oh, this person doesn't care about America. No, these are things, again, where we're lucky to have our strategy and our values in concert with one another. Let's take advantage of those historic moments. Let's not shun them. And I think, again, there was an unfortunate choice in this instance on this issue to shun it. I fear we may pay the price.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, we didn't get to talk about the sanctions regime that had been put in place, the maximum pressure campaign by the Trump administration. And if we had another hour, we could cover a lot more here, but it did seem that was working. And it is a shame that it wasn't really given enough time to be more effective than it had appeared to be. Ben, thank you so much. I know you have to be on the Hill, and you're so busy. Yeah, please. Yeah. What final comments, please?
Final comment on that, just because it doesn't get enough credit. People think that was a rush to that sanctions regime. Make no mistake, Trump was one of the two. This is not a political defense. This is just objective reality. The other Republican who, when they were campaigning in 2015, 16, who said they would not leave the deal on day one was Rand Paul. But Trump and Rand Paul have a very somewhat different foreign policy approach. Trump's MO, for what he said, this is not me, this is the then candidate, was that I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. Then there was a decertification of the deal, not on day one, but in October 2017. Then between October 2017 to May 8, 2018, the US worked with its transatlantic partners to try to fix the deal. They agreed on 3 vectors: sunsets, missiles, and inspections. Ultimately, that transatlantic fix, American and its European partners couldn't see fully eye to eye. The Europeans couldn't even bring themselves during that period of time to issue one missile sanction against the Islamic Republic. They would point out the missile issues of the Islamic Republic in UN reporting, but the last time they had used those authorities against Iran was December 2012. That's the last time they used those missile authorities against the Islamic Republic. This multilateral coalition failed. The US left the deal on May 8, 2018. May 8, 2018, the US spent 180 days in 2 90-day increments, resuming the sanctions that it had previously waived. By November 5th, those sanctions were on the books. Then from November 5th to May, the US had issued oil waivers. Ultimately, in May, it removed those oil waivers. So May 2019 to January 2021 is when full max pressure was really there. That's a little under a year and a half. And there's people saying that this is what got us here. This policy failed. That's a joke to have America's most powerful, peaceful tool of deterrence, coercion, and punishment only be in place for a year and a half. When you have an adversary as resolute as the Islamic Republic, and you've inherited a policy as flawed as the JCPOA, which has given them this money and has allowed them to retain their nuclear snapback and their nuclear infrastructure, and to get us not into an actual war with Iran. We came close on a couple of times to have removed their most prominent terrorist general from the battlefield and not risk World War III. These were all successes. Let's not make a mistake for some partisan reasons. There's a right way and a wrong way to build pressure on Iran. And I think Republicans and Democrats have to learn from the past, the Obama era, the Trump era, and the Biden era.
Well, that also goes to another article that you had written that I don't have time to pull up, but it was called, that everybody can look, I guess, on the website, 5 Lessons Learned from Sanctions on Iran for the Ukraine Crisis. And it was a really terrific and compelling piece. Please check that out, because, again, we didn't have enough time to really talk about sanctions, but we're watching it play out with Ukraine. And when when Biden says, oh, we should give it, a month or so to see how it works. Well, I think that we know that, first of all, the Ukrainians didn't have that much time, but second of all, in terms of how sanctions work, a month, as you point out, the year and a half with Iran, it was having influence, but it wasn't really the full potential. So thank you for walking us through the timeline of how that was put in place and what transpired with that. And Naomi just put your latest article, your other article in the chat. It is, it's a little late, but thank you for staying with us this long. I appreciate you joining. You're always brilliant and wonderful to hear your insights and share your knowledge. So thank you for joining us. And thank you to everybody who has joined this afternoon. This is recorded and will be available for you to share. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.